K'vod Harav. The words are disappointing. I don't know about you, but last year I was convinced that this would be it. That was the last Tisha B'av. So I thought.
Women are going to be invited on this side also. Women are also invited. All the women want to come in this.
The words are disappointing because we were convinced last year that we were at our last Tisha B'av. We put the keynotes back on the shelf, and we said it'll be something that will show our children and our grandchildren and say, you never guess what we used to do on Tisha B'av. We used to sit on the floor, we used to cry, we used to read Eicha, and there would be a chag for them. And that's what we thought. And how disappointed we are that we're here again. I want to thank the Rav for inviting me, and just to a little of the personal, because it'll inflect some of the words. I was raised by my father, who came here with me, and was raised by my parents in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. After high school, I went to Yeshivat Hakotel for yeshiva, and I stayed for 8 years. And then I've yet to decide whether it was a mistake or it was a good move, but I went back to America. I was a rabbi in Beverly Hills for 7 years, and then a rabbi in Boca Raton. And then this year, a week and a half ago, I had the merit of moving back to Eretz Yisrael. Thank you. Tisha B'av is a challenging day. During peaceful times, it's difficult for us to feel the day. It's difficult for us to understand what the tragedy is. I imagine during crusades and during pogroms and during the Holocaust, it was very easy to feel Tisha B'av. It was a poignant day. We felt it. We knew what it was. We looked around us and we understood our life is a Tisha B'av. But the times we live in, sitting in a beautiful shul in Yerushalayim, looking out the window and you see the walls of Yerushalayim. This week I was in yeshiva for the first week. I have a wonderful, wonderful position at Yeshivat Hakotel. And this is my first week at the yeshiva, and davening mincha every day, looking out the glorious windows that we have, and looking out at our Abayis. And yes, there's something there that we wish wasn't. And there's something that we wish that was there is not. But it's difficult, at least for me this week, it was difficult for me to feel the 3 weeks, the 9 days, Shavua Shechal Bo, and now Tisha B'av. Even today, in our lives, we have a horrific war going on to the south. And we have tragedy after tragedy. And we're living with it. We're living with it. Most of us are checking the news whenever we can and looking to see what's happening. And every single time someone falls, and every time a rocket falls, we feel it. Our own personal lives are not interrupted to an extent where our lives are a walking Tisha B'av. For me, Tisha B'av used to be, at least for the last 10 years, I used to feel it. I used to feel it very easily because I wasn't in Eretz Yisrael. So for me, I would look around my shul, and both shuls that I was in were big shuls with plenty of people, and they were decorated nicely. And I would look around and I would say this, okay, it's easy to feel what's missing, because I'm going to go home tonight, and my view is not going to be of Yerushalayim. And that was a little easier to feel at Tisha B'av. But now, this Tisha B'av, for me at least, I'm sitting and I've just experienced a personal geula. And it's so hard. It's so difficult to feel what this day is all about. The one time I truly felt the Tisha B'av, we have in Yeshivat Hakotel, I don't know who's familiar and who's not familiar, we have Rosh Shlomo Fisher. He used to be the Av Beis Din of Yerushalayim. And every 5 or 6 weeks, he comes to Yeshivat Hakotel, and he graces us with his presence and delivers shiurim to us. And one year, he came on Shabbat Chazon, which was immediate into Tisha B'av. And that night, right after Shabbat, He went back to his apartment. Everybody went back to their apartments to go get their keynote and come back. And he walked in, and on Shabbat, Rav Fisher's Yerushalmi, and we all see how they dress on Shabbat. It's this glorious robe with a full shtreimel. And they look, we might not dress that way, and we might never aspire to dress that way, but it looks like royalty. And that's what I expected to see when he came back a mere couple of minutes later to read Eicha for us. But he walked in and he personified what Tisha B'av was all about. His long robe was worn. At the elbows they were frayed. They were dusty. His hat wasn't the shtreimel, but it was a worn black, I don't know what it's called, but sort of a thin hat around. And he walked in, and instead of his vigor that he usually came in and strode in to give a shiur, he walked in telling of old age, of weariness. And you looked at Rav Fisher and you understood what Tisha B'av was about. He was a man born in Yerushalayim who had lived through the tragedies of Yerushalayim. And you understood that when he changed his clothing into his Tisha B'av clothing, he went from that majesty of Shabbat to the sorrow of a Tisha B'av, and you understood it. And today, with the modern day state of Israel, it makes it all the more challenging. What I'd like to speak about tonight, I'm sorry that I didn't announce the topic ahead of time, but what I'd like to speak about tonight are the dichotomies, three dichotomies of modern day Tisha B'av. And what those dichotomies add to the challenge of us feeling the Tisha B'av. We all look forward, this will be our first dichotomy, we all look forward to the days of Mashiach, to a Messianic era. I imagine most people here are local, and I can't tell you how jealous I am that in a time of Mashiach you're going to be footsteps away from a Beit HaMikdash. It's unbelievable to picture. But what will be different during those times? What's going to change? We all have images and fantasies of a life much easier, and a life where we don't have to go to work and we don't have to struggle and everything just is perfect. But it's not true. That's not what a Messianic era is. It's better. It's better than what we have now, but there's one thing our sages tell us is different, and one thing only, and that is that there will not be shibud malchiot. What is shibud malchiot? Pressure from the other nations. That's it. Without the pressure from the other nations, our sages tell us, each of us will be able to grow at a much faster rate. It'll be easier for us to grow, both individually and as a nation. How so? Shibud Malchiot stems, this pressure that we have from the other nations, stems from their lack of recognition of God. They don't recognize God as we recognize God. They might believe in a God. They might believe in an image that they've created of God, but they don't believe in the God that we believe in. When Avram Avinu taught that God existed, when he taught monotheism, it wasn't just a lesson in philosophy. He didn't just go around and teach people that God existed. He taught ethical monotheism. He taught that God existed, but it required a certain behavior on our parts. The idea that God existed directed and dictated a set of character traits that we had to possess. And that's really what Avram spread around, what we call the Derech Hashem, the way of God. That's what Avram taught. And historically, even nations that claim to believe in God, even nations that claim to be subservient to a higher maker, even those nations don't direct their actions by that recognition. Those nations act in a way completely inconsistent with the recognition of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. They put pressure on us. And at that extreme, the way they treat us as Jews, they turn into crusaders and Nazis. And that's the fulfillment, if you pardon me for reading, of the verse that we just read, Am hayta kamana, Rabati b'goyim, sarati b'medinot hayta lamas. She that was great among the nations, a princess among provinces, has become subsidiary. Referring to Yerushalayim, Koreh Bagdu Bahayullah Lo Yavim. All her friends have betrayed her, they have become her enemies. That's how we're treated by nations that don't have that recognition of God, that don't direct their actions by this knowledge that God exists. Yet, at the same time, what do we find? While certain nations to this day still treat us that way, the world's power treats us as the greatest ally, as a friend, defends us in the United Nations, sometimes the only voice, gives us billions of dollars of aid. Without it, we couldn't have the schools and the yeshivot that we have today. It's been said that at no time in Jewish history has as much Torah been learned as is learning today. And we couldn't do that without our single greatest benefactor, it would seem, the United States. How do we reconcile the image of a city widowed, estranged, because of nations that don't recognize God, when the greatest nation in the world, it would seem, helps us and aids us? That's our first dichotomy of a modern-day Tisha B'av, where we want to sit here and we want to say the other nations of the world don't treat us well, and yet we see that one treats us in an exemplary fashion. Our second dichotomy is right outside the window. We talk about Zachor Yerushalayim Yemei Aniyah Muradeha Kol Machmudeha Asher Hayu Mimei Kedem, that Jerusalem recalls the days of her poverty and her miseries and all the precious things that were there from the days of old, and we don't have it today. For 2,000 years, we prayed for a rebuilt Yerushalayim. And if you'll allow me to quote James Fenton, a poet, who described the desolate Jerusalem, he said, "It is superb in the air, suffering everywhere, and each man wears his suffering like a skin. My history is proud, but mine is not allowed. This is the cistern where all wars began." In truth, except for a chosen few, for thousands of years, Yerushalayim mostly existed in our imaginations. Jews had no clue what they were picturing. Can you imagine today having no idea what this looked like? It's difficult for us to fathom. But a Jew living in Spain and France, who had never seen Yerushalayim, had never seen a photograph because they haven't been invented yet, had no image of really what a Yerushalayim looked like. It was imaginary in their minds. And yet, in our Shemona Esrei, they would pray deeply that Yerushalayim should be rebuilt in mercy. And they would pray for a day when there would not be a Tisha B'av. They would pray for the kingdom of David HaMelech to be reestablished. And that pain that they would feel on cold winter nights, where a czar would send a messenger, taxing them, burdening them. Family members would disappear. And they would go again to the Beit Knesset the next morning and pray their hearts out for something they could not fathom in a physical sense. Yet today, we find Yerushalayim. I want to read you. I'm only going to tell you the source afterwards because, unfortunately, even today we're not supposed to laugh. But if I tell you where this comes from, you'll laugh. But listen. Yerushalayim today is a city of overwhelming emotions. A city that promises a religious and spiritual experience, excitement and pleasure, interesting tours and entertaining adventures. There's the wonderful market, which is one big sensual celebration. Here you can buy Armenian-style decorated ceramics, beautiful strings of beads, authentic clothing, embroidered cushions, colorful wool carpets, candles, and amazing glassware. From the promenade along the tops of the old city walls, you can look out over the old city and the new city. The city's lights sparkle, making the sights even more unforgettable. It's a beautiful description of today's Yerushalayim, right off a tourist website that talks about why you should visit Jerusalem. But it's a beautiful illustration of what we have today, of what our ancestors couldn't even picture. it's difficult to reconcile that image with the pasuk of Echa Yeshva Badar Ha'ira Basiyam, that the city that was once so populous remains lonely. Today, Yerushalayim is beautiful. The halacha is, and some of us, because we're so blessed and privileged to live so close, we don't put this halacha into practice. But for those around the world, when they see the Irei Yehuda, they rip their clothing. And when they get closer to the city of Yerushalayim, they extend that rip. And when they see the Makom HaMikdash, that Makom HaMikdash, they rip again the Kriya of Avelut, of mourning. Chavetz Chaim has an interesting comment in his Mishnah Berurah on this halacha. He says, why are we tearing Kriya? Why are we so sad? And he says, and many understand this to be literal, and that the halacha has switched today. Because the city of Yerushalayim is under the domain of the Muslims. But today, in Yerushalayim today, it's not. It's ours. Those famous words, Har Habayit B'Yadeinu. It's our Yerushalayim. And many don't tear Kriya anymore because of it. Because it's ours, because things have changed. And yet, even those that don't tear Kriya anymore will read these Pesukim tonight. And they'll read the keynote tomorrow morning. And they'll sit. And how do they reconcile that dichotomy of Yerushalayim that's Yashva Bedad, that sits alone, with Yerushalayim that we see? And again, this second dichotomy makes it so challenging for us to feel a Tisha B'av. And our third dichotomy, for me at least, is the most powerful. In his explanation of fast days, the Rambam wrote that fast days are a method of calling out to God. In reality, we fast as a method of teshuvah. A fast day, if we would go through Tisha B'av today, tomorrow, and we wouldn't do teshuvah in certain aspect of our lives, the day is a waste. It's a wasted day. You could be just as hungry as your neighbor. You could be in just as much pain and discomfort as your neighbor. But if you haven't changed one thing in your life, if there hasn't been one aspect of tshuva, the day is a waste. In fact, before there were fast days, there were days Yemei Tza'akah. If we were plagued by a famine, if we were plagued by disease, if there was a war, the Chachamim of the generation would declare that the day was a day of Tza'akah. We would blow the Chatzotzrot, the trumpets in the Beit HaMikdash, and we would gather around. And rabbinically, the rabbis would institute either a series of fasts or a large communal fast. And it would seem, in explaining a fast day as a reaction to some sort of a trouble, some sort of a tsar that's plaguing the community, of a disease, war, famine, it would seem that the Rambam's message was that why do we have these tragedies? It's our fault. It's because of our actions. And therefore, the proper response is teshuvah. And yet, in fact, I don't believe that that's true. I don't think it's possible for us to declare or to know with certainty, absent prophecy, what the cause of a tragedy is. But rather, how do we respond to tragedy? What's the proper reaction when disease plagues us? When war occurs in our midst, what do? And the answer is we pray. The answer is we introspect. We try to improve on ourselves. Because if we don't do that, then we have no chance of God changing our situation. If we stay the same, the situation remains the same. If we change, we have a prayer, and a very good one, of the situation changing. And today, on the fast days that we have, including Tisha B'av, days that are set into the calendar, the Rambam requires another explanation. What did I do? What did I do to deserve this day? What did I do to deserve a lack of a Beit HaMikdash? I'll never forget, I took my shul in Beverly Hills to Yerushalayim for a learning experience. It was a mission, but thank God everything was peaceful. So what do you do on a mission when there's no tragedy? So we went to a yeshiva to learn. And we took one of those tours under Yerushalayim, and we went to the house of the Kohen Gadol. I'm sure many of you have been on this tour. And the tour guide is taking us through, and he shows there's a display case in the house of the Kohen Gadol. A display case, like you have here in the shul and we all have in our homes, where we put our silver. We put things that we want to show, our beauty, our family heirlooms. And what was in this display case that they had set up in the house of the Kohen Gadol? Idols that they found. Pesach, an idol. He said, look, these idols we found, they're 2,000 years old. And I'm looking at this, and I'm thinking to myself, this is what we're displaying. There's really a mitzvah to destroy them. It's in the Torah. One of the 613 mitzvahs. In Eretz Yisrael, if you see a pesach, you have to destroy it. And we're looking at it as if it's part of our culture. It's part of our tradition, and there's nothing more foreign than an idol. And it's a good thing I had my wife with me, because as my blood is boiling, and as the tears stream down my face, that this is what caused all our tragedies. The thought has to enter your mind. Never in a day would I ever pray to something this big. It's so strange to us. And we ask, what could they possibly have thought? But one thing's for sure, I didn't do that. That's not me. So why am I fasting? What did I do? And the answer is the same exact thing. Because the reason why generation after generation there's no Beit HaMikdash is not because of what happened back then. It's because of what we're doing today. It's not just the idols. It's the sinat chinam. It's the hatred that we have. We go on the bus and we drive down the street and we look at somebody and we say, they don't do this like I do. Or why do they have to do that? I don't do that. They're so different from me. And we go home and we talk about it. You see what this community is doing, what that community is doing. They're crazy. And that's nothing but sinat chinam. When I speak Lashon Hara, and I don't observe Shabbat the right way, I'm just repeating their sins. It's the exact same thing. I'm repeating it, and therefore the Rambam says, as long as we don't have that Beit HaMikdash, you can be assured of the fact that we are just like them. We are exactly like they are. And we fast today. Why? To remember and to awaken us. Not to a tragedy of 2,000 years ago, but of a present tragedy today. A tragedy that we have no Beit HaMikdash today because of our actions today. And if we don't begin to change them, they'll be exactly the same way tomorrow. It would seem, based on this explanation of the Rambam, that we are living in times as sinful as the times we read about in the Gemara and the times that we read about in our Nevi'im. It would seem that we're no different than them. Yet look around. Look around us. We mentioned before that there's never been a time in Jewish history where people have learned as much Torah today. We're a city awash in Torah observance. There are mitzvot everywhere. Everywhere. Stats. According to the Ministry of Finance, and we all know how they get to these numbers. In 2010, there were 130,000 people learning Torah full-time. 130,000 people just in Eretz Yisrael. And what's that number? Those are only people taking money for it. That excludes every teenager, every little child, everybody learning Torah that's not taking money for it, every Hesder student, and every Yeshiva Gvolah student. It excludes them. Minimally, we're talking 300,000 people studying Torah. Minimally, Har Sinai, double that. But now add in everybody else in our nation that's studying Torah. We far surpassed that great moment. 46% of every Israeli Jew considers themselves somewhat Torah observant. Over 88% believe in a Kadosh Baruch Hu, and 78% have a Pesach Seder, and 63% of this great nation fasts on Yom Kippur. Take the most secular Jew that we have. The most secular Jew that you could ever imagine. And we know they're doing mitzvot. They might not intend to do a mitzvah. They might deny that they do mitzvot, but they're nice to their parents. That's kibbud av v'em. They're doing mitzvot. I don't know if you listened to the speech, but when President Rivlin was first elected, he said the most beautiful line. I don't know if you noticed it. It made my week. If you heard it and you took notice of it, then you're smiling. President Rivlin said, and I hope to put a smile on your face, give you some hope. But he addressed the nation and he said, now I'm no longer a politician. I'm echad imam. I'm for everybody. And he said, Jew or Arab. And he started listing different types of people that this great land is made of. Do you remember what he said? He said, to those that are religious and are shomer mitzvot, and those that are shomer less mitzvot. There's great wisdom in that line. We're always saying there's religious and not yet religious. He took it the next step. It's much better. There is not religious and not yet religious. There are Torah observant people, and there are people that are not as Torah observant. It's difficult to reconcile the Rambam's words that we're living at sinful times with what we see around us in a modern day Tisha B'av. So how do we understand it? How do we understand the dichotomy of a modern day Tisha B'av with what we're reading in Keynote? And I'll give you at least my thoughts. Mourning over Tisha B'av and its causes comes in degrees. It's not black or white. It's not yes or no. It's degrees. And there's a line. There's 100% there's a line. And at one point we're going to cross that line where we're no longer as sinful. And when we cross that line, when we make it, that'll be a messianic era. Are we almost there? Who knows? Do we pray? Do we wish? Do we desire with all of our being that yes, this is the last Tisha B'av? 100%. But we're looking at an improvement, but we're not quite there yet. Hashgacha, divine providence, works the same way. It works in degrees. It's not a yes or no thing for our nation. We don't sit here and say, are we under Hashgacha Pratit? Are we not? Is this just Klolit? How do we know? Well, it works in degrees. It's yes, it's no. It's yes, it's no. It's somewhat. And our very last dichotomy, I'd like to add one in. Always know that when a speaker says that there's three, there's always going to be a fourth. The pain that we suffer in today's times when we turn on the news. The pain when we hear news out of Gaza. My first night here, you can't imagine the talks that you have with your children why we're still moving in the midst of a war. Google my name when you get home and see the newspaper articles that were written about those of us that came during the war. The newspaper articles are fine. Read the comments section below. Look at the comments. I was in Florida. That people in Florida write. The headline is, families move to Israel despite it being a war zone. We all know the reality versus the perception of people that have never been here. But the comments weren't just surprising. Jews always came over to us and said, Yashikach, it's a great thing. But the comments that people wrote on the bottom, the parents should be arrested. It's child abuse to bring a family here now. The hurtful, hatred comments that people left. I don't know these people, they don't know me, and it's not personal. They have no perception of what's truly going on here. But my first night I arrive, and it's exciting to be here. It's a dream of 10 years for our family. And we arrive. And my mankal is an aloof something in the Israeli army. I haven't gotten all the ranks down packed. So he's not in yeshiva. But I get a text. I'm already on the mass text of the yeshiva day one. And I get a text that a boy in Shir Gimel, Evyatar Turjaman, Zechron Tzadik Levracha, was killed as we were landing. And our welcome to Eretz Yisrael, a land that we're so proud of, where Rav Lau and Natan Sharansky greet us at the airport to tell us, Yashikoach, I'm moving here. You're going to love it here. That night, I'm at a funeral on our Herzl. A boy I never met, but a boy from our yeshiva. And that's the dichotomy of a Tisha B'av. That boy died al Kiddush Hashem. Died because of the Churban that is today. We look for a day of shalom, of peace. We look for a day of not a building being rebuilt. It's secondary. We look for a day when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is looking out for us, where there'll be no more losses for us. That's what we're hoping for. Every time we read of a pigua, we hear the news interrupted. Every single time, that's a Tisha B'av moment. That's because of today. That's the pain that we have today. It's the ultimate dichotomy that we live with, where we're so proud of what we've built and so sorrowful when even a little of it is chipped away. In his laws of Teshuvah, the Rambam tells us to imagine ourselves on a scale. He tells us to imagine ourselves where one action can tip the scales to our merit or unfortunately to our demise. He tells us, he extends it. He says, that's how you should imagine your country. And that's how you should imagine the world. Where we're balancing on a very slippery slope. Where one mitzvah can tip the scales and one sin can tip the scales. In your next moment, the Rambam says, imagine that the world hangs on your shoulders. We need to look at the four dichotomies that we discussed. And we need to realize that there's great pride, great simcha in what we have. And yet at the same time, there's great tragedy. We need to introspect. We need to improve. And that's what today is really all about. Thank you.
You don't look old enough to take a resume.
I'm sorry?
You don't look old enough to